CGTN, China Global Television Network.
I'm very proud to be the first African. I'm proud to be the first woman. But I always tell people that the important thing is to have the competence to deliver the results. In other words, if you're the first woman and the first African and you can't deliver, that doesn't help. So I'm focusing on delivery. I'm focusing on getting results. And I want to make sure that people remember my continent producing the first leader of the WTO that made a difference.
The 164 members of the World Trade Organization officially selected Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala as its 7th Director General. The Nigerian economist and former finance minister makes history as she becomes the first woman and the first African to lead the WTO. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala takes the helm at the global trade body at a particularly difficult time for the world's health and economy, with the COVID-19 pandemic having triggered barriers to the international free flow of goods and services. So how has Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's journey been to the top of global trade governance? And what challenges lie ahead of her as the world works to recover from the COVID-19 economic downturn? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala formerly served as Nigeria's finance minister and has spent 25 years at the World Bank, where she rose to the #2 position of managing director. CGTN's Deji Badmus has more on the now new World Trade Organization Director General and what her appointment means for Africa.
Her journey to the top of the WTO has been a remarkable one. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has come a long way after holding several high-profile positions both at the global stage and in her home country, Nigeria. She served as Nigeria's finance minister twice, was a managing director of the World Bank, and also a head of the Global Vaccine Alliance, Gavi. And now she's setting a record as the first woman and first African to head the WTO. She says the import of it all is not lost on her.
I absolutely do feel an additional burden. I can't lie about that. Being the first woman and the first African means that one really has to perform. I've always said these are wonderful things. It's groundbreaking. All credit to members for electing me and making that history. But the bottom line is that if I want to really make Africa and women proud, I have to produce results. And that's where my mind is at now.
Across Nigeria and Africa, many are celebrating her for landing the WTO top job.
First African, first woman, that is significant enough. I mean, and that's why everybody has been celebrating her, even beyond the African continent. And especially in a period where people feel that women should be allowed to play more significant roles in society. Of course, she comes fully qualified. She's not the WTO DG on the basis of being a woman, but on the basis of her qualification for the position of a Director General of the World Trade Organization.
In Africa, expectations on her remain high, especially given the recent launch of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area.
We are now going to depend on her to guide us in the implementation of our Africa Free Trade Area, because other trading blocs may be having issues with us in what we are trying to do. Because when you have this our agreement, what we'll do is that we'll waive duty among ourselves, all right? Within the WTO, there's what they call MFM, which is the most favored nation clause that says all members should be treated the same. But the African members are treating themselves the same, but not the others. So some may take us to court there and then say that we are discriminating against them.
When the euphoria eventually dies down and she begins work on March the 1st, Okonjo-Iweala faces the difficult task of uniting the members of the WTO so that the organization could begin to work towards more transparent and open global trade. Deji Badmus, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Well, let's now bring in our panel. Joining us in Johannesburg, Zimkita Swana, international relations expert. From Lagos, Professor Patrick Utomi, professor of political economy at the Lagos Business School. And in Accra via Zoom, Dr. Francis Mangeni from the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Thank you all for joining us in this discussion. Professor Utomi, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala is the new Director General of the WTO, a move that is seen as historic both for Africa as a continent and also for the WTO itself. Now, it is a huge responsibility with many expectations from across the world. Reconstruct for us her journey to the top. First, African woman, first Director General from Africa at the WTA. What are the qualities that got her to that position?
Thanks, Phil, very much. I think the first thing to note is the value of investing in women, investing in the youth of a country. And I say by way of paradox because many years ago, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala from the World Bank joined the then British High Commissioner in Nigeria and one or two of us in a conversation at dinner about the need to produce a demographic dividend from Africa's population. And this meant investing in the young people so that instead of having a population time bomb, Africa would have these educated young people who could transform things. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala herself is a classic example of a person who, through quality education, has had a career track that has impacted much and has allowed her to come to this position. As we all know, she has degrees in economics from Harvard and from MIT, and she's had a long career at the World Bank, a career that had a pause once, twice to come in and do public service at ministerial level in Nigeria. And so she served as a reformist finance minister. And this is really a great strength that she brings to the position. And then served in a foreign minister role, returned to the World Bank. She serves on several global corporations. In her role on those boards, she has a pretty global feel. And I know that the fact that during her World Bank career, she also served in Asian countries from posts at the World Bank.
Right.
So she, in effect, had a bird's eye view of seeing Asia's emergence as a trading power from a very low base. And so I think that all of those are going to inform the approach that she does take to her role at the WTO.
So, Zimvita, I do want to come to a point that Professor Utomi has mentioned, that Dr. Okonjo-Iweala talked about the need to invest in women to get a dividend from the continent's women. What does this mean for you, Zimvita, as an African woman?
I think as an African woman, and even the rest of the world has recognized that this is a milestone in the sense that she's been listed by Fortune magazine and Forbes and other magazines as in the top 100 of women, in the top 3 of African women, in the top 150 of the world's most influential people. It is an incredible journey that she's gone on in terms of her background in Nigeria, coming to some of the most prestigious universities in the world, coming back to Africa to make some reform change, and then to come to the helm of one of the most prestigious multilateral organizations in the form of the World Trade Organization. She's made a huge trek that not everyone could have achieved, and her 40-year career has built up to this moment. It gives us hope as young, educated women that we could be leaders of the world. I sincerely believe that the future is female, it is feminine, and she's a symbol of that.
Dr. Mangeni, let me come to you because Okonjo-Iweala has talked about reform at the WTO, and one of the issues she's mentioned is changing the governance structure at the World Trade Organization. Because if we look back, as far back as last October, though, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala already had about 70% of support from member states. What is it that the U.S. had reservations about?
So the United States of America, under the previous administration of Donald Trump, was opposed to the election of Dr. Ngozi as Director General of the WTO. because she was perceived as an economic liberalist, someone who supported globalization, whereas the Trump administration was pursuing a policy of America first, which tended towards protectionism. So they didn't think that she would be in line with that American policy. However, the Biden-Harris administration, the current administration, doesn't take that approach of the Trump administration. The Biden administration is in support of strong multilateral institutions, including a strong World Trade Organization, which plays its fair share in the global order, and is therefore quite supportive of Dr. Ngozi's candidature, which is how we have come to have her elected.
The last 4 or 5 years, have been quite turbulent for multilateral trade. Confidences by many countries in the WTO and in the trade system has been rather shaken. In the words of Dr. Ngozi Iweala herself, she has said that there is much mistrust within the WTO, not just between the US and China, also between the US and Europe, between Europe and China, between the developing world and the developed countries. I mean, what is it that Dr. Ngozi is going to do to try and restore confidence in the WTO and reaffirm its position? How is she going to navigate, Professor Utomi, that mistrust she's talking about at the WTO?
I think an interesting thing about all of this is that she has a little bit of every one of these constituencies, in a manner of speaking. She is African, she is a Nigerian, but she's also majorly American in her career and everything. So in spite of the position that the Trump administration took with her, it should have been easy to say that she understands what the game is from the American side. She's also sensitive to China's role in Africa and China's emergence in the world generally. And so having a sense for all of this makes it easy, I think, a little easier for her to navigate the conversations that need to take place, because there's a lot that needs to happen. The WTO has generally been seen as not so fair to everybody. And it has a legacy. It comes down from colonial history. I mean, global trade, the way that it has come from the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs through till it transformed into WTO in 2002, it's come from a colonial arrangement in which trade was between the colonies and their metropolitan, superiors, and that was how the international trading system. So there was unfairness built into the trading system, no question. How do you begin to resolve this? How do you ensure that an organization that was dominated by Europe in terms of its leadership for a very long time, now having someone come from outside, first of all, not from the traditional trade negotiation community,
right?
Because there's orthodoxy within the establishment of the way that we have done things. She comes as an economist, not so much as a trade negotiating person, and that was one of her big advantages in my view over many of the other people who contested. And she brings an outside perspective, understanding trade, understanding the dynamics of the economics, but distant enough to look at outcomes in terms of economic performance beyond the pure negotiation issues that multilateralism was trying to deal with, to how globalization has not quite done enough for the weak in the system. And I think that's where she will have an even hand in ensuring that things work out well.
Zimfita, one of the issues that has come out as from the WTO is this notion that the WTO rules favor the developed countries more than developing countries. Now, does the new appointment, though, give developing countries here an advantage against the background of what Professor Utomi has just talked about, a new engagement in trade and economic policies?
I certainly think it does give the rest of the world a chance. You must bear in mind that the organization had been set up initially for the benefit of the developing world, of the developed world, excuse me. for their own purposes of facilitating a liberal global market. But now that she is at the helm, she will obviously champion a new WTO that's fit for the 21st century, that will try to address the ills that we've carried from the 20th century, such as the inequality that is in the world, the poverty, climate issues in terms of even climate justice, green economy, and those are issues that largely affect the developing world the most. So she will definitely champion the needs and the issues of the developing world. She has also got a challenge to help to delineate what is the real and true definition of developed and developing. Because in the organization, you can facilitate trade agreements in accordance to your level of development. But I think she's going to try to encourage developing countries to play a larger role in the organization in the form of making more contributions so that their issues can be championed. So the reason why you have an imbalance in terms of developed countries having more of a say and leading the agenda is because of their contributions. However, if she does lobby the developing world to step up and to play a bigger role in the organization, they will have a chance to contribute to the agenda and to perhaps add their issues onto the agenda.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment, but let's take a short break. And when we come back, we'll have more on Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's new appointment. To stay with us.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now let's continue our discussion. Still with me from Johannesburg, Zimkita Swana, from Lagos, Patrick Utomi, a professor of political economy at the Lagos Business School, and in Accra via Zoom, Dr. Francis Mangeni. Dr. Mangeni, Africa's share of global trade is still about like 3%. So many, of course, will be looking at the upcoming of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and wondering what are some of the things that can be done at the WTO that will make a difference for Africa's share of global trade.
So again, fortunately, as Dr. Ngozi has made it very clear, she has made no secret of it, she is going to play strictly by the WTO rules. And she has pointed to the preamble to the WTO agreement, which says the WTO is there to ensure improved living standards, full employment, decent work, and sustainable development in the context of using optimally the resources of the world. She has said it, and she has said that this should be at the front and the center of the WTO agenda. So in this sense, then you can see how the priorities of Africa, the existential priorities of Africa for addressing poverty, for ensuring the global economic order is equitable, and that Africa has policy space for development. These priorities are preserved and are taken on board at the WTO.
I want to get Zimkita's view on this, though, Zimkita. Should Africa be optimistic, particularly in terms of Africa's share of global trade, if there will be a change as a result?
In the Africa Trade Agreement, there was an effort made to align the agreement to the WTO framework. So the agreement is compliant. And that means that the African Union can look to the WTO for advice and can make sure that it can use some of the technical assistance and the resources that the WTO has to help to bridge the gaps which have been there in terms of expediting the process of unifying the African continent in terms of free trade. The WTO has got the capacity to help Africa to identify the reasons why some of the free trade requirements have not been met. In many instances, the regional economic bodies have struggled to form a free market and a single market and to unify into customs unions, and the WTO could help to facilitate and negotiate those processes amongst the regional economic bodies. So Africa can then trust, with her at the helm, that they will have a friend indeed in the organization who will help Africa to make sure that their dream of a unified continent can be concretized, especially in a legal sense. The WTO is an organization which has also a dispute settlement body, which the African Union has also mirrored in its Africa Free Trade Agreement. In other words, Africa can then learn from the WTO's experience of equipping that body as a trade dispute settlement body and adjust it to the continent. And so, in other words, Africa can hold hands with the WTO, more so now that she's at the helm.
Dr. Ngozi has talked about a reform, that the WTO is facing many challenges and needs deep and wide-ranging reforms. Very briefly, what kind of reforms are we likely to see at the WTO? Dr. Utuomi.
Now, we're living in a globalized world, whether we like it or not. Even though the Paul Krugmans of this world are beginning to step back a bit from their, big support of globalization to wonder about a few things, the point remains that we live in a globalized world. And if we are too narrow in thinking of our immediate advantage, we might lose out. Let's take the vaccine nationalism thing. Look, if you were to ensure that everybody in some rich country is vaccinated, the next threat comes from some people who are not taken care of, and these can go on to your own detriment. So we need an environment of rules that will enable people to see broader interests in how choices are made. And I think that is what she would probably argue, with some dexterity, to show people that, look, we can create a win-win world with not going to take optimal advantage. After all, what we have seen, even in the evolution in big economies like the United States of America, of antitrust laws, were based on a recognition that in the end, these momentary advantages create disadvantages for everybody. And that's really what I would like to see her spend more time educating everybody to see a win-win track going forward.
Zimfita, your thoughts, though, on the reforms that could be taking center stage at the WTO?
I think that most importantly, she wants to reform the Secretariat and how it's functioning, just to bring about more representation in terms of females and youth. The reform, I think, as well, is to try to encourage the rest of the Bretton Woods institutions, including the World Bank and the IMF, to encourage trade within the countries where they are providing aid, to provide aid that helps countries to develop a domestic industry, because since a liberation in most of the developing countries, many industries have been lost. So to facilitate aid provision that will ultimately lead to a profitability and revenue streams for those countries that are receiving it. I think she would also like to bring about a balance of the powers, and how she did that was in terms of her deputy directors. She's chosen China as one and France as another. In essence, it's a tripartite alliance between a couple of regions, Europe, Africa, and China, who represent a big part of the economy as well. And so her reform would also be, instead of having big power politics, try to have even multilateral representation or multi-country representation within the Secretariat and within the structures that are making decisions. I think another issue of reform is to take on board the complaints that America had with the dispute settlement body, that it just has a deadline to settle disputes and give a resolution within 90 days, but the record has shown that it does not give the the decision down within 90 days. So to try to expedite the process and try to streamline how the decisions and the judgments are made is another reform that she'd try to expedite. And also, she'd like to make sure that the WTO negotiating platform is more accessible to the developing world. The developing world does have seats, they are members, but they don't make use of the tools that are available to them. So I think she would like to bring more developing world countries on board in terms of making the most of the WTO in their own negotiations and agreements that they reach with other countries as well. So she'd like to reform the organization as well to be more proactive.
Right.
In the sense that it's looking to futures and issues that are to come and not only reactionary. And I think she is the one that can do it.
Dr. Mangeni, I want to get a very brief and final comment from you on that note of making the most of the WTO. From an African standpoint, though, what proposals would you have for Dr. Okonjo-Iweala in terms of making her ideals realized, particularly for the continent?
Yeah, so first and foremost is that she has proposed that the ministerial conference of the WTO should meet more regularly. At the moment, it meets once every 2 years. This is far apart. So maybe if the ministerial conference met more frequently, maybe annually, that would be helpful. In Africa, for instance, our presidents meet once a year. It used to be twice a year. Our ministers of trade meet at least twice a year. So this would be very helpful to take forward the reform agenda. Agriculture remains a priority for Africa, addressing export subsidies, domestic support, and there needs to be progress on this. Dispute settlement remains a priority for Africa. We need to make use of the dispute settlement system as a linchpin. And it's good that Dr. Ngozi is already talking of a third way when it comes to problems that exist at the WTO. Means there is always a way out which can be found if there is enough trust to produce some trust through some quick wins. So we believe that she can advance this agenda and Africa can benefit from these reforms at the WTO. Regarding the Secretariat itself, she wants a team-based, task-based approach at the Secretariat rather than the current silos. So this also would be helpful in having an effective Secretariat that helps to deal with Africa's priorities as well. In the area of services, we also need progress in trading services so that we as Africa can have a global market for our services exports, because the services sector constitutes at least 50% of the GDP of Africa. In some of our countries, it contributes up to 70%. So this is a priority for us as well. So this is what I would say in terms of our priorities. But of course, above all, it's the African continent of free trade area. We need to do something ourselves as well as Africa. We shouldn't just look to others to help us. We need to do something ourselves under the African continent of free trade area to make sure we implement it. Our work is cut out for us under the African continent of free trade area, which we must now implement as our priority of priorities ourselves.
All right, to you all, we'll leave it there for the moment, and that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts in Johannesburg, Zimkita Swana, International Relations expert. In Lagos, Professor Patrick Utomi, Professor of Political Economy at the Lagos Business School. And in Accra via Zoom, Dr. Francis Mangeni, Africa Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. Remember, you can be part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Until next time, goodbye.